It takes two to tango. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. You can't thread a moving needle. These are just some of the myths, the stereotypes, the misogynistic statements which are given about violence against women and girls. Examples of statements which serve to excuse, to condone violence against women, to suggest that somehow people who are victimised through violence are somehow equally to blame for their victimisation. We can see this through history. We see examples of judges, in one case, saying that a victim of rape had been negligent and had somehow contributed towards her rape. Why? Because she had been hitchhiking. In another case, a man who had killed his wife walked free from the courts, with the judge saying, that woman would have tried the patience of a saint. Assuming that 6 of one, half a dozen of another, it takes two to tango is true in cases of domestic violence. Violence against women, and I'm saying violence against women rather than against men, because today what I'm talking about is a structural inequality that affects women the world over. It is not to suggest that violence does not happen towards men, or that women are sometimes violent towards men, which they undoubtedly are. But today I'm talking about violence against women, something which kills women all over the world every single day. Last year, just in the UK, 118 women at least were killed at the hands of men. And that's an extreme example, perhaps. I'm talking about homicide, about femicide. I'm talking about sometimes the ultimate acts of control, murder-suicide, where a man kills his partner, his children, and then kills himself. But there are other forms of violence as well that can leave women feeling restricted in their life for years, for decades in some cases. So what does a domestic violence perpetrator look like? Well, he looks exactly like some of the people in this audience, actually. He looks like the person who's standing behind you in the supermarket queue. He looks like the police officer. He looks like the taxi driver. He looks like the barman. He looks just like we all do. As a criminologist, we do a lot of research with domestic violence, and we do some research interviewing perpetrators of domestic violence. And as part of that, we need to, as everybody does who does primary research, we need to fill in ethics forms. And as part of the ethical requirement, we think about what the risks are to our participants, but we also think about what the risks are to ourselves, to our research teams. And the sorts of things we put down when we're interviewing violent men are, well, we'll telephone somebody when we go in and out of the interview so that people know that we're safe. We say we'll do the interviews in a public building where there are people next door in case we get into any difficulties. But in reality, these are not the main risks to the researchers doing interviews with violent men. When they come out of the interviews, they feel odd. They say, he seemed quite nice. He seemed really normal. I could imagine having a drink with him in the pub. If I was sat next to him on a long train journey, I would have quite happily spoken to him all the time. They don't appear as monsters. They don't appear as the Hulk. And they certainly don't have perpetrator stamped across their forehead. In my own interviews with domestic violence perpetrators, I'm reminded of the first domestic violence perpetrator that I ever interviewed about 15 years ago. And he told me he was on a domestic violence perpetrator program, a course that tries to re-educate men and try to help them to stop using violence, to choose to change, to choose to not use violence in their relationships. And he said to me, do you know what? My friends think it's funny I'm on this course. Even my GP says, I don't know why you're doing it. You're a really placid person. And that's how perpetrators often come across to other people. They're not a threat. They can be the person who is the life and soul of the party. They can be the person who is, in other ways, fighting for social justice, for social equality. As an outward person, they can be one of the most safest people for you to be with. But within the relationship, it's different. Alcohol. There's even a lager that has a nickname of wife beater. Alcohol, drugs, bereavement, stress, testosterone. These are all some of the reasons which are given for why men's violence against women happens. Being unemployed, being overworked, having children, not having children, having too many childcare responsibilities, not being able to look after the children because of work responsibilities. Whatever the situation, there is a myth about why violence against women happens. And if it doesn't work for the men, it can work the other way around. As a criminologist, I often spend time in courts watching magistrates and judges listen to domestic violence cases. In one of the most recent days that I spent in court, I heard time after time alcohol being blamed as the number one reason why violence against women was happening. Men who were working away and not able to drink came back and somehow went on a big drinking binge, and then came back and were violent towards their partner and sometimes their children as well. If it worked the other way around, it was because of the woman's drinking. In one case that I heard, which involved an attempted rape, physical violence and violence against his children one evening, it had been New Year's Eve. They'd both been out. The man had not been drinking, he had been driving. The woman had insisted on going out for more drinks. He didn't want to, he wanted to stay in. He was the good guy here. She had insisted on going out. The defence in this case continued to make a point about how much she had drank, even to the extent of saying what she had been drinking all night. And what was this terrible high alcoholic drink that she'd been drinking all night? Archers and lemonade. Whatever happens, there is another reason that is often given for why men's violence against women continues. And violence isn't always physical either. In fact, the worst violence often isn't physical. Now, whenever somebody is killed within an intimate partner relationship, we do domestic violence homicide reviews. We look at who knew what, who could have helped, how could we have intervened sooner. And what we often find is for the domestic violence homicides, there hasn't been any recent history of physical violence. There hasn't necessarily been call-outs to the police. And that is because in the most controlling relationships, in the worst cases of domestic violence, in the cases that end up in death, there hasn't had to be any violence. Violence may not have been used for years, for decades even. The threat of violence, the threat of what could happen to herself, to her children, to her pets, to her family, these things are enough to keep her in her place. 10 years ago, Evan Stark, an American academic, wrote a book called Coercive Control: The Entrapment of Women in Everyday Life. And in this book he reminded us, even just through the title, the entrapment of women in everyday life. He reminded us how close gender inequality within our day-to-day lives, within our lived relationships, within our everyday interactions with each other are gendered, and that it is those, not violence, that links gender inequality to violence against women and the continuing violence against women. We now have a new law, it came out last year, called coercive and controlling behaviour. This is about that constant checking of Facebook messages, of always needing to know where somebody is, of being half an hour late and having 90 missed calls on your phone, of not having the freedom to stop off at the shop on the way back because you'll be accused of what you've been doing. Have you been with another man? Why have you got your hair done? Why did you buy those shoes? One of the women we interviewed talked about how he wanted her to look beautiful and have her hair done and wear a short skirt and heels whenever he was out with her, but forbid her from doing that the rest of the time. She told us, I felt like a doll that was turned on and off at his will. But hey, it's 2017. Surely violence against women then is illegal, we have laws against it. Surely in the Western world this isn't still happening. Surely they're in prison, these domestic violence perpetrators. I wish I could say that is the case, but my extensive research over 15 years on this topic tells me not only that it isn't true, but also that it possibly isn't going to happen, at least anytime soon. In fact, most of the men in prison who are domestic violence perpetrators will be in for a different crime. We know that policing is a problem. We know that the courts are a problem. I gave the examples earlier of how women were seen as somehow contributing towards their offence, the idea that in violence it takes two to tango. Even this morning, driving into Durham, I heard on the radio of a judge telling women that they shouldn't drink alcohol, they shouldn't get so drunk if they don't want to be raped. So what do we do then? We look at the building blocks of gender inequality, and we look at them at the very basic level. We look at them when people start playing with building blocks. We look at them as babies and toddlers. I was on a mummy's Facebook group last week, and often people offer things for sale, or they offer things for free if anybody wants them, kind of passing things on. As children grow so fast, they're fit things 1 minute and then they don't the next. And somebody was offering for free, anybody who can collect, free to anybody who can collect, 5 hooded baby towels. Lovely offer. And then somebody had commented underneath, are these for boys or girls? Babies' towels? We are gendering babies' towels from the minute they come out of the womb. Are these for boys and or girls? When I was looking at tips for this TED Talk, I typed into Google the question, what makes and then I typed in the word G. I was going to type in, what makes a good TED Talk? And by accident, I typed an I after G. And the 3 top options it gave me were, what makes a girl good in bed? Second option, what makes a girl pretty? The third option, what makes a girl happy? And I just thought, how depressing that it is the third one down that comes to what makes a girl happy. And unfortunately, I think that tells us a lot about gender inequality within our world. So if we want to end violence against women, we have to remember that it is gender inequality and other forms of inequality that intersect with gender inequality around disability, around sexuality, around race and ethnicity. It's not alcohol, it's not drugs, it's not mental illness. It's gender inequality, and we need to think about the ways in which we tackle that within our everyday life. This isn't just about the big gestures, it's not just about the changing of laws. It's not just about the judges or the police officers, it's about us in our everyday life. And this really is where it does take two to tango. When you think about equality within your day-to-day interactions, in your relationships, in your workplaces, in volunteering. Think about the acts which you do and think about how they can be gendered. And refuse to comply with those gender norms. Try to resist, actively resist those gender norms in your everyday life. Dress your girls in blue. Dress your boys in pink. Think about who takes the minutes at work. Think about who tidies up after meetings, who washes the cups after the coffee morning, who takes responsibility for organising collections when somebody has a baby, who takes responsibility for going to get the leaving present if somebody's leaving. Think about it within your household. Who does the emotional labour? Who buys grandma's present? Who books the table for Mother's Day lunch? Who takes time off when the kids are sick? And think about these things, and think about how you enact gender in your relationship. And let's try to put these gender norms and stereotypes in the bin for good, because it is only by changing one generation at a time that we are going to change gender inequality and see an end to violence against women. Thank you.